A warm welcome from Pioneer Public School. I'm Jyotsna Dethi, and the lesson that we are going to learn is how I taught my grandmother to read. Students, in this lesson, we will learn about the ideal relationship between a grandmother and a granddaughter, and how an ideal relationship shares love and respect among the family members. This story also depicts the empowering qualities of education. This story is written by Sudha Murthy. Sudha Murthy was born in 1950 in North Karnataka. A prolific writer in Kannada, she has written several short stories. Her stories deal with common lives and human values such as charity, kindness, and self realization. In this story, How I Taught My Grandmother to Read, there are two main characters. The meaning of character is a person, animal, creature, or thing in a story. Writers use characters to perform the actions and speak dialogues. There is a main character, that is the narrator, a 12-year-old girl. And another main character in the story is the narrator's 62-year-old grandmother. The setting. Setting is the time and geographical location within a story. The setting of this story is a village in North Karnataka. Now we will learn more about this particular chapter. In this lesson, we come to know that the narrator lives with her grandparents in a remote village. The narrator's grandmother, who does not know how to read, is in the habit of listening to stories from the weekly magazine Karmavira that the narrator reads out to her. She is particularly fond of Kashi Yatre by Triveni that appears as an episodic novel in the weekly magazine and excitedly looks forward to each episode of the story. Now, we come to know the grandmother's problem. The narrator's grandmother does not know how to read, and this is a challenge for her. Now, the problem complicates. The narrator goes away for a week to attend a wedding. In her absence, the grandmother receives the latest copy of the magazine. She looks at the pictures in her favorite episodic story, but cannot read the words. She feels extremely helpless and dependent. The resolution. Resolution is the act of solving the problem. Now, grandmother finds out solution to the problem. That is, the grandmother decides to learn to read Kannada so that she can become independent. She asks the narrator to teach her how to read starting with the Kannada alphabets. She sets a deadline for herself and works hard to learn how to read. Ultimately, by the deadline, she is able to read. The narrator presents her the novel version of her favorite episodic story. Now we are going to watch a video
My grandmother, Krishtaka, never went to school, so she could not read. Every Wednesday, the magazine would come, and I would read the next episode of this story to her. During that time, she would forget all her work and listen with the greatest concentration. Later, she could repeat the entire text by heart. My grandmother, too, never went to Kashi, and she identified herself with the novel's protagonist. So, more than anybody else, she was the one most interested in knowing what happened next in the story and used to insist that I read the serial out to her. After hearing what happened next in Kashi Yatre, she would join her friends at the temple courtyard, where we children would also gather to play hide and seek. She would discuss the latest episode with her friends. At that time, I never understood why there was so much of debate about the story. Once, I went for a wedding with my cousins to the neighboring village. In those days, a wedding was a great event. We children enjoyed ourselves thoroughly. We would eat and play endlessly, savoring the freedom because all the elders were busy. I went for a couple of days, but ended up staying there for a week. When I came back to my village, I saw my grandmother in tears. I was surprised, for I had never seen her cry even in the most difficult situations. What had happened? I was worried. Ava, is everything all right? Are you okay? I used to call her Ava, which means mother in the Kannada spoken in North Karnataka. She nodded, but did not reply. I did not understand and forgot about it. In the night, after dinner, we were sleeping in the open terrace of the house. It was a summer night, and there was a full moon. Ava came and sat next to me. Her affectionate hands touched my forehead. I realized she wanted to speak. I asked her, "What is the matter?" "When I was a young girl, I lost my mother. There was nobody to look after and guide me. My father was a busy man and got married again. In those days, people never considered education essential for girls, so I never went to school. I got married very young and had children. I became very busy. Later, I had grandchildren and always felt so much happiness in cooking and feeding all of you. At times, I used to regret not going to school, so I made sure that my children and grandchildren studied well. I could not understand why my 62-year-old grandmother was telling me, a 12-year-old, the story of her life in the middle of the night. But I knew I loved her immensely, and there had to be some reason why she was talking to me. I looked at her face. It was unhappy, and her eyes were filled with tears. She was a good-looking lady who was usually always smiling. Even today, I cannot forget the worried expression on her face. I leaned forward and held her hand. "Ava, don't cry. What is the matter? Can I help you in any way?" "Yes, I need your help. You know, when you were away, Karmavira came as usual. I opened the magazine. I saw the picture that accompanies the story of Kashi Yatre, and I could not understand anything that was written. Many times I rubbed my hands over the pages, wishing they could understand what was written. But I knew it was not possible. If only I was educated enough. I waited eagerly for you to return. I felt you would come early and read for me. I even thought of going to the village and asking you to read for me. I could have asked somebody in this village, but I was too embarrassed to do so. I felt so very dependent and helpless. We are well off, But what use is money when I cannot be independent? I did not know what to answer. Ava continued. I have decided I want to learn the Kannada alphabet from tomorrow onwards. I will work very hard. I will keep Saraswati Puja Day during Dasara as the deadline. That day I should be able to read a novel on my own. I want to be independent. I saw the determination on her face. Yet I laughed at her. Ava, at this age of 62, you want to learn the alphabet? All your hair is grey. Your hands are wrinkled. You wear spectacles and you work so much in the kitchen. Childishly, I made fun of the old lady, but she just smiled. For a good cause, if you are determined, you can overcome any obstacle. I will work harder than anybody, but I will do it. For learning, there is no age bar. The next day onwards, I started my tuition. Ava was a wonderful student. The amount of homework she did was amazing. She would read, repeat, write, and recite. I was her only teacher, and she was my first student.
I hope you have enjoyed this video. Let us understand the story in detail. What were the two reasons that made Triveni a popular writer? Two reasons that made Triveni a popular writer were: her style was easy to read and very convincing. Her stories usually dealt with complex psychological problems in the lives of ordinary people and were always very interesting. What was the story in Karmavira? Why did grandmother identify with the story? The story that appeared in Karmavira was an episodic version of the novel Kashi Yatre, written by Triveni. It was the story of an old lady and her ardent desire to go to Kashi to worship Lord Vishveshwara. In the story, there was also a young orphan girl who falls in love, but there was no money for her wedding. In the end, the old woman gave away all her savings for the girl's wedding instead of using it to go to Kashi. The grandmother identified with the story because, like the old woman in the story, she too had never been to Kashi and had a desire to do so. Here we have come across a new word, that is ardent. So the meaning is very enthusiastic or passionate. Why could the grandmother not pursue her education? The grandmother could not pursue her education for various reasons. When she was a young girl, she lost her mother. There was nobody to look after and guide her. Her father was a busy man and got married again. In those days, people never considered education essential for girls, so she was never sent to school. She got married very young and became very busy as she had children and later grandchildren. Because of these reasons, she never got a proper education. Why did the grandmother feel dependent and helpless? When the magazine arrived in the narrator's absence, the grandmother was eager to know the next part of the story. She looked at the pictures but could not understand the text. That is when she felt a sense of dependence and helplessness for not being able to read on her own. Why and how did the narrator reward the grandmother? When the grandmother started learning how to read, she had set Saraswati Puja during Dasera as the deadline when she should be able to read a novel on her own. When Dasera arrived and the grandmother had learned how to read, the narrator rewarded her by gifting her a copy of the novel Kashi Yatri. How did the grandmother show her gratitude towards her granddaughter? The grandmother showed her gratitude towards her granddaughter by touching her feet as a mark of respect due to a teacher. Now, what does this story teach us? We are going to summarize the lesson. This story brings out the ideal relationship between a grandmother and a granddaughter, that of love and respect. The grandmother's love for her granddaughter and her dependence upon her can be seen clearly. The granddaughter too loves her grandmother and takes it as her duty to read to her and later to teach her how to read. It is apparent from their conversations and the way the grandmother confides the story of her life in her granddaughter that the two are very close. We have come across a new word that is confides, which means tell someone about a secret or private matter while trusting them not to repeat it to others. One more new word, apparent, that is clearly visible or understood. This story brings out the value of education. The story brings out the value of education by depicting the otherwise independent grandmother's helplessness at not being able to read by herself, a problem that she resolves through hard work and determination, thereby restoring her sense of pride and independence. We have come across to a new word that is determination. The meaning is the quality of being determined or firmness of purpose. This story depicts the empowering qualities of education. So students, here we have completed this lesson, how I taught my grandmother to read. Thank you.